Hello, this is Neely, and welcome back to Meet Me in the Middle. Thank you so much for being here, and if you have made it to this episode, first of all, thank you. And I assume that you like this podcast, so I ask you please share it, like it, rate it, do whatever you can to spread the word, because at some point I really want to start bringing in guests and attract enough interesting, smart, educated people to debate some of the hard issues that we want to talk about. On this episode, I'm going to focus on our founding story. But before I really start to go into that, I want to highlight that researching American history and how it's been taught throughout time really fascinated me, and I thought I'd just share some of the things that I've discovered about that before really diving into American history. I have to claim I am not a teacher. I am not university educated on the subject. However, I have educated myself through really digging deep and reading a lot of books on many perspectives of American history. So pulling out the facts that seem to be shared, however, being portrayed differently is one thing, but the facts that I think that everyone shares, and if we can kind of combine them all into the founding story, because it is only one story, but it's a story being told from many perspectives. So looking into how the education system has portrayed American history is really interesting. First of all, there are 34 currently, maybe 35, depending on what source you find, but it's a pretty close number, 30-something, different core textbooks for high school that are teaching American history. And just as a reminder that education boards in the states are the ones who set the standards and agree the curriculum points. And those who do not follow the curriculum points are penalized, as federal funding is a way that a lot of the education system is actually funded. There are different states and different counties that handle how schools are receive their funding, but for the most part, federal funding and state funding are key to keeping our education system healthy. So the standards are set by the states, which is why we have so many different textbooks. 34 is what I found. That's interesting. And when you look at all the topics in our education system, like science and math and all of these different subjects that our children and we learned through school, American history seems to be the only bullet point in the education system that is used to fight and instill values versus teaching the facts about actual history. It is one of the most manipulated curriculums throughout time. And it's not really blaming anyone's side. I think it's both sides. It has been manipulated, and it is a very hot topic on the political campaign trail as well throughout history. Why is that, do you think? I mean, our history is our history, and our values are our values. I don't understand why values are being pushed in to how to teach history, which is supposed to be based on facts. So that in itself, just to kind of ponder on that before we sort of dig in to this episode and hopefully lay a foundation for the sole purpose of understanding the different perspectives and drawing a line saying these three perspectives are our founding story. and embracing that reality without feeling in some way oppressed. We need to build our common story so we can actually start to move forward to talk about some of the other things that we want to discuss. So I thought I'd just throw that out there first before we dive now into these three perspectives of our founding story. We need to build a common story in order to continue to make change in this country with a common purpose. We kind of need to set the record straight from the very beginning, because we only have one founding story. When told together, however, I can only hope will bring understanding to the point that we can all claim our founding story as inclusive and true. Because feeling heard and validated and valued is what inspires people to make change and push forward towards a common purpose, and allows us to then accept the differences and the diversity of who's here in America now. Because there's so many different types of people here. We are a nation of immigrants and continue to grow in our diversity. There are so many cultures here and so many beliefs here now that our nation's founding story continues to build on the reality that unless you're native, you come from immigrants wanting a better way of life, pushing forward for the dream that America promises. And America has delivered on that American dream for many people in this nation. Some of us haven't fully realized it because of our position of where we started from and the fact that education isn't equally the standard, is not equally set. And I think that that's really important, that our standard is set for every single child will have this level of education. Of course, the states drive the curriculum on their boards of education. However, if we ensure a standard, as there are federal dollars that go to the education system in this nation and allocated to the states, which the states allocated to the schools and so forth, then at least everybody has the same shot, no matter what your starting point was. And that doesn't mean that if you have the money that you want a higher education, more privatized, more religious-based. That's all the freedoms that we enjoy here in America. But for the average American, there should be the same standard across all of the states without encroaching on the power that each state has over the way that they choose to govern and the things that they would like to be instilled as values. That's why the different states are so important to understand what's going on in your state. People really spend time on focusing on the federal government, which is really important, and we need to talk about it because it does drive a lot in our lives. But the things that affect us most in our daily lives are things that have happened at the state level. And education is one of those things. So understanding that, we can actually push forward and say, okay, that is our founding story. Now let's move on to understanding more and more and more, and start talking more and more and fighting less and less. As this is what this is all about, trying to find the middle ground. But the middle ground does not mean building a fantasy. The middle ground is building the foundations based on facts that can be uncomfortable, that can make you sad, make you mad. But without understanding where we came from, how do we ever have a chance of actually moving forward and not repeating the things that we would never want to see repeated? So let's get into it. Okay, so the founding story will be told over 3 episodes. The first episode, the natives. The second, the European immigrants, which I will refer to as colonists in the first part, and the slaves the colonists brought here. These 3 stories are crucial to declare a common founding story, to build a common purpose, as we are all now American citizens. So let's start with the key events depicted by the American natives known as Indians. This land was known as Turtle Island by many native tribes prior to the colonization of what is now known as the United States of America. There were approximately 600 tribes, and the population is not specifically known, but was somewhere between 900,000 and 100 million in the Americas. No exact numbers are known for the United States. This is really North and South America was all part of Turtle Island. I'm going to focus this on the United States territory and not the continent of the Americas as a whole. To say this land was discovered by the colonists is the first misconception that should be clarified, as this land was inhabited by many. 1492 was not the start of our founding United States story, as told by the European immigrants in our schools and what I was taught. But from the natives' perspective, this is where the story begins. Christopher Columbus landed in the Bahamas on the Pinta. He believed to have reached India, hence the name indigenous or Indians. In 1507, Amerigo Vespucci, an Italian merchant, claimed the New World as not being part of Asia, and hence the name America was born. So the Americas was named after Amerigo. It wasn't until 1513 when Ponce de Leon landed in Florida and fought with the Calusa tribe that the Native Americans were confronted by the colonists from Europe. In 1524, Florentine explorers kidnapped a native child who was brought to France. In 1528, the Spanish sent Panfilio de Narvaez, who claimed Spanish royal title to the land that is now Tampa Bay. In 1546, new laws coming from England, barring the enslavement of natives, was quickly repealed by the New World colonists, who were developing their economy and societies using slave labor consisting of Native Americans captured by the colonists. In 1585, Ralph Lane failed to establish a colony in North Carolina called Roanoke. In 1598, Don Juan Onate declared possession of Hopi tribal land in North Arizona in the name of the Spanish crown. In 1607, Jamestown was founded by the London Company in Virginia, the first colony to stick. 105 settlers established Jamestown, and within a year, only 35 survived. Captain John Smith was the first leader of the Virginia colony. Captain John Smith was captured by Chief Wahanasaka, later referred to as Powhatan, Chief Powhatan, and introduced to the Jamestown settlers. He was later released back to Jamestown. The Powhatan natives brought maize, beans, squash, with fresh and smoked meats to Jamestown to help the settlers survive as they almost abandoned the colony due to starvation and battles with the other natives. In 1611, Dutch lawyer Adrian Block explored Manhattan and returned to Europe with 2 kidnapped natives who were later renamed. In 1614, Pocahontas, whose real name was Malka, married tobacco farmer John Rolfe, which brought peace with the settlers of Jamestown and the Powhatan tribe. I apologize if I'm saying these incorrectly. I've tried to say them correctly. 1616, smallpox spread throughout the land and disseminated huge populations of natives in New England. The Powhatan natives witnessed the first arrival of African slaves in 1619. They landed in Virginia. This was a horrifying sight to behold as they were shuffled to the settlement in chains. This weakened the peace between the tribes and the settlers. In 1620, Christopher Jones on the Mayflower landed in Providence Harbor on their way to the Virginia colony and were met by the Wampanoags. The Pilgrims escaped on a small ship which landed in Plymouth, where they settled, and were also helped to survive by receiving food from the Wampanoags. In 1626, Peter Minuit, a Dutchman, bought Manhattan from the natives and called it New Amsterdam. In 1628, Massachusetts Bay was founded by the Massachusetts Bay Company. In 1637, the colony of Massachusetts was founded, and the Pequot natives were enslaved and later traded with African slaves and sent to Bermuda. In between 1636 and 1638, the Massachusetts Bay Colony joined in the Pequot War, where 700 natives were enslaved and killed, which wiped out the tribe, and any survivors were absorbed by the Narragansett and Mohegan tribes who fought along with the colonists. In 1675 to 1678, King Philip's War, also known as the First Indian War, the Wampanoag chief who adopted the name Philip because of the friendly relationship his father, Massasoit, and the Mayflower Pilgrims. The colonies amassed a militia of 1,000, along with 150 native allies, to attack the Narragansett. By the end of the war, the Wampanoags and their allies were publicly executed and were left landless. The main question the tribes had is how many will come and how will we survive this theft, enslavement, and genocide. Throughout these battles, treaties were signed and broken, and signed and broken. In 1709, the first slave market in New York was erected, where Africans and natives were sold to the highest bidder and named as property. From this point in history, natives were slaughtered and enslaved across the lands and pushed further from their homes as settlers claimed more and more land, and more treaties were signed and broken and signed and broken. 1758, the first Indian reservation is established by the New Jersey colony. This was also when the missionaries established the American Indian residential school system on native reservations. 1763, King George III prohibited English settlement west of the Appalachian Mountains, and all settlers beyond these mountains were mandated to return to the east to ease the tension between the colonists and the natives. In 1775, the American Revolution begins. In 1776, the 13 colonies claim independence from the British Crown. The Continental Congress authorized the recruitment of 2,000 paid natives to join in the fight with the colonists against the British. Every tribe refused. The only known tribes to fight alongside the colonists were the Oneida and the Tuscarora. The Mohawk joined the British. The war lasted until 1783. In 1789, Congress declares power over the natives and appointed native agents to enact treaties across the lands. In 1790, the Indian Trade and Intercourse Act passed, which meant all treaties and boundaries will be negotiated in the presence of a federal commissioner and ratified by Congress. More treaties were signed and broken and signed and broken. In 1804, the U.S. government gave the first official notice to all natives to move west of the Mississippi, known as Oklahoma today. This kicked off the Indian Removal Act, finally signed into law by Andrew Jackson in 1830. This act was in the making for almost 30 years. The 5 tribes encompassing over 60,000 natives of the Cherokee, the Muskogee, the Seminole, and the Chickasaw, as well as the Chilocta tribes that were forcibly removed from their ancestral homelands. This ethnic cleansing and forced displacement that continued from 1830 to 1850. In 1831, the U.S. Supreme Court ruling abandoned the Indian sovereignty, and all natives were known not as sovereign nations, but domestic dependent nations. As the expansion west grew and states were added to the Union, war and treaties continued. Sitting Bull, a Lakota leader, led by many successful battles like the Red Cloud War, the Great Sioux War, and the Battle of Little Bighorn. The victory was short-lived as the government assigned soldiers to the area and forced the surrender of many natives. Sitting Bull refused and fled north to Canada in 1877, where he was met by James Monroe, who became an advocate for Sitting Bull. In Canada, Crowfoot, the leader of the Blackfoot tribe, and Sitting Bull, who were enemies in the United States, brokered peace and shared a tobacco ceremony. In 1881, hunger and desperation led Sitting Bull back to the United States to surrender. He and approximately 180 family members and followers were sent to Fort Randall and held captive until 1883, when he was released to move to the Standing Rock Reservation in the Dakotas. The reservation was established in 1868 as part of the Fort Laramie Treaty. Sitting Bull died on the reservation in 1890 of a bullet wound. He stands as one of the great warriors for all Native Americans. Hundreds of treaties were drawn up over the decades, and not one has been honored to date. We saw this play out in 2016 with the protests between the Dakota Access Pipeline and the Lakota Sioux Nation, breaking the Fort Laramie Treaty of 1868 once again. 4,000 American veterans joined in this fight under the name Veterans Stand, and busloads of veterans arrived in Standing Rock at the Sacred Stone camp established at the base as a base for the protests. Many celebrities came to Standing Rock to stand with the natives, along with 9.2 million Americans signed a petition to stop the pipeline. President Obama was being pushed to act. He was about ready to leave office, and finally, at the last minute, ordered the Army Corps of Engineers to complete the environmental impact study demanded by the natives before continuing the pipeline project. However, several months later, President Trump took office and signed an executive order on day one to proceed, and sent the Army Corps of Engineers out to remove people from the Sacred Stone camp and arrest all protesters. This was a moment that changed my life forever. Personally, it sent me down the quest to studying Native history that I never learned in school growing up in the 70s and 80s. I did not know how many natives were still here. It's important to note this fight for the right for natives' territories to be respected under treaties that have never been honored is not over. They still fight today. In 1871, the U.S. government prohibited any more treaties from being signed with natives from that day forward. In 1849, the Department of Interior was formed and took over the oversight of the Bureau of Indian Affairs, which was started in 1824, which was under the War Department. The Bureau of Indian Affairs established the residential boarding schools outside the reservation, which saw children removed from their families and forced to assimilate into Western society. They were beaten, killed, and traumatized, along with the families that lost their children. The establishment of the boarding school system, the Indian Removal Act, the establishment of reservations on lands unknown to the natives, they forced the natives to become dependent on the federal government and strip them of their culture, their identity, and their children. It wasn't until 1924, that the Indian Citizen Act was passed that recognized all natives born within the borders of the United States were American citizens. It wasn't until 1967 that interracial marriage was adopted in all states by the Supreme Court ruling, even though some states had adopted it earlier, this allowing the natives and the colonists to marry. There are 5.2 million natives that exist today, only 2% of the population despite the genocide from the beginning. This is in no way the full story, but it shows to be a significant part of the founding story. It was their land first. The natives were instrumental in the unification of the United States, and over hundreds of thousands of natives have served in our military, giving them their right to being recognized as one of the founding stories that make up our common founding story. In 2021, the first native is appointed by President Biden and confirmed by the Congress to lead the Department of the Interior. This is a groundbreaking appointment and to be celebrated as a step towards a resolution to the self-governance that they deserve. This is part one of our founding story and weaves into our total story, which we will continue to lay out in the next 2 episodes. Thank you so much for being here, and I'll catch you on the next podcast. Don't forget to remember that from the middle and from understanding is how we're going to get back to talking to solve the problems that we have in this nation together. Thank you.